The quill scratched a number while a man convulsed on the slab, and I said the count aloud. 1, I said. And my voice filled the chamber louder than the prisoner did. My fingers kept the ledger flat. Obsession pushed them, not a theory, but a practiced compulsion to make pain into figures I could read and control. The strapped body's shoulders jerked and a raw sound tore out. I marked the tolly with a precise, downward stroke and did not look up. Master Viclav adjusted a strap by the wrist and watched me. He did not speak. The single light over the slab burned low and fit the room like a wound. I will not soften what I did next. I sat at my bench and counted again while the instruments rested in a neat row on the table. The first 3 sentences of my life here are ledger lines. I arrived with a key on a cord, an ink-stained thumb, and a refusal to let a scream be accidental. I learned the chamber by touch. I learned breathing patterns by measuring them against the grain of the wood. I learned that the smallest sound could announce ruin. The problem was concrete. Sometimes a tally matched a sound I could not place to any applied device. The counts did not line up with the metal. That mismatch became the difficulty I chased, Jakub Viclav said once, low enough to break the rule that nothing private belongs to a clerk. Read me the last line. He leaned over the ledger and tapped the row with a heavy finger. I read it. He clicked his tongue. You left a mark I do not understand. His voice cut like brass. I felt a shift in my stomach, a brief, hot doubt. I closed the book and said, it matched a cry I heard before the straps moved. He did not like doubt. I kept the ledger open because paper allowed me to prove what my ears told me. We moved through the beats of the morning with businesslike cruelty. The nameless lay under a coarse tunic, wrists tied, lips split, eyes glassy. He made sounds in waves, a dry rasp, then a higher pitch, then silence. I counted. My voice was calm too. I said at an odd rise while the iron sat untouched. Viclav turned his head. He nothing then. He only watched the reaction on the man's face. The second emotion that nudged me forward came as a quiet, focused fear. Not the bright panic of the prisoner, but the cold alert that something measurable in the room refused to obey the chain of cause and effect. That fear moved my hands to ink. After the session, I carried the ledger to the bench and sat with its weight as if it were a body. The chamber smelled of damp stone, iron, and wax. I smoothed the page and traced the tally I had written during the strange sound. The hair along my arms lifted. The mark aligned with a tiny noise I'd thought was the creak of a strap. I pushed back from the bench and listened. Silence sat in the corners like a patient. The third sensation rose, curiosity that pressed at the edges of my method. I had been a clerk long enough to know when a procedure required correction. My obsession told me to test the anomaly. My curiosity told me to begin a controlled trial. I could not do this alone. Viclav's authority shaped the chamber. He supplied instruments, men, the timing, the public show. I asked him for permission in the way all subordinate men ask. By producing evidence and risking his disapproval, Master Viclav, I said, setting the ledger between us, the tally from earlier does not match the application. I pointed to the mark. He looked at the page and then at me. Jakub, he said, you make numbers for a living. If a number shivers, perhaps your hand trembles. Repeat the session. Make it simple. Make it honest. His voice steadied into command. That was the point when doubt hardened. My hands went cold and I realized he meant to insist that spectacle and tally match because spectacle fed authority. I needed to show the room that sound followed steel. I arranged a test for midnight and ordered assistants to delay the instruments by my count. We prepared the chamber with steps that had become routine. The slab was washed with cold water. Chains were tested for sound. I checked the ledger's binding, the twine at the spine, the feather quill's nib. There is a comfort in ritual. It keeps the mind from slipping when you watch other men suffer. The nameless, a new man, or another face I did not have to name, was led in, bound, and placed on the slab. He kept his head turned. He had a torn cloth around one wrist. He breathed in quick, shallow pulls. I instructed the assistants, do not touch the straps until I say. Viclav stood with his brass, handled rod held like a scepter. The room waited. I felt the shift from curiosity to controlled intent. My pulse slowed because I needed numbers to be exact. I tapped the quill against the ledger 3 times and spoke the words that would begin the experiment. No instruments until I count to 3. I told them. My voice sounded small under the vault. I tapped the quill and listened for the body's first flinch. Then a thin voice left the prisoner before any rope tightened. It began like a note reached through a seam, a soft intake, then a pitch that rose in a pattern I recognized from previous tallies. I froze. My hand hovered over the paper. Vclav's jaw tightened. The assistants looked from me to the man on the slab. The sound was not a reaction to metal. It came from within the bound figure and matched the rhythm I had catalogued before. I wrote nothing at first. I needed more than coincidence. I started the trial again and again. Each time, the same anticipatory cry came before contact, my ledger filled with lines that matched the sounds, line after line. The numbers stacked into a sequence that resisted explanation. The chamber grew taut with an anger that was not mine. Vclav gripped his rod and moved closer. Jakub, he said, his voice a hard cut. Explain. He stepped to the slab and struck the floor with the butt of his rod. The man did not stop crying. Vclav's face moved from impatience to irritation. You claim sound precedes action. He asked. You claim the body makes noise before the cause. Yes, I said. Yes, Master Vclav. The cries begin before any instrument touches skin. There was a bite in his next words. You must be testing me, Jakub. You must be trying to make me forgive mistakes with superstition. He spat the last word. The room contracted as assistants shifted feet and the Nameless pulled at his bonds. We argued then, fast and hard. 3 men threw words like hammers. Explain yourself, Vclav demanded. The ledger shows the timing, I said. Read the lines. Listen when you are not moving your hands. The sound comes first. The sound comes from fear, Vclav said. Fear of the instrument. Fear of me. Fear makes the throat seize. You want to put meaning into a natural reaction. Fear does not account for the pattern, I said. It repeats in counts I made when no one approached the slab. Then you will demonstrate that pattern under my command, he said. You will prove it or be replaced. The exchange rattled through the chamber. The argument was short, 3 to 6 lines back and forth until Vclav snapped his hand and ordered a harsher demonstration. He intended to reassert the chain where effect preceded cause, where the rod announced the scream. His choice forced the chamber to escalate. Assistants seized the instruments and moved them toward the man's shins. The Nameless began to make small sounds again, anticipatory and precise. My pen trembled. The confrontation set the stage for the climax. Instruments rose, men leaned forward. I started to count, but the sound arrived in a chorus that did not wait for metal. Voices swelled from the bound body, from the corners of the room, from throats that had held back. The noise synchronized into a single, anticipatory howl that rolled against the stone and broke my rhythm. My counting stopped. The ledger's page soaked with sweat and ink because my hand had faltered. The sound did not belong to a neat cause. It arrived as a collective motion that could not be written into lines by one clerk. When the hull peaked, something in Vclav shifted. His face went pale where oil had darkened it. He slammed his rod down until the wood bit into the stone and the assistants recoiled. The room fell into a stunned silence that left my own breathing loud. The Nameless lay still, his chest rising in shallow waves, eyes closed. We had reached a moment none of us had rehearsed. The phenomenon stitched the rules by which Vclav built authority. After the confrontation, there was a slow, practical clean-up. Blood was wiped from a strap. The rod was returned to its loop. The assistants muttered about discipline and spectacle. Vclav stood with his hands on his belt and watched me as if weighing the ledger's usefulness against the risk of it making the chamber look foolish. Jakub, tell me one thing. If your numbers cannot be bent to our show, what is the point of writing them? This not as question but as verdict. I answered with silence at first. Then I spoke because silence would give up the ledger's promise. The point is truth in measure, I said. If the sound comes before our action, that fact changes how pain is shown and owned. Vclav's expression did not crack. He clicked the ring on his hand and turned away. The assistants began to clear bodies and reset the slab. The Nameless opened his eyes and met mine. He mouthed nothing. He had no words left. His throat worked. His lips were cracked and dry. He looked at the ledger on my bench and then down at his wrists. I sat with the ledger before dawn approached and the room cooled. The final beat of the night arrived as a small, concrete event. The quill slipped and smeared ink across a tally. The smear looked like a thin line of blood on the page. My reaction to it was immediate and physical. I pressed my thumb to the smear and felt the warm tack of it under the nail. My hand shook. For a fraction of a breath, I thought of clearing the mark, of making the record neat again, of restoring order. That was the temptation to hide what we had seen. The other temptation, the one that pulled at me, was to expose it and let the ledger show a pattern that would make men uneasy in the halls above. I considered both choices like a man weighing a blade. The ledger felt heavier than any instrument because its numbers could condemn more than a rod. They could invalidate spectacle, reveal that fear had its own life. I closed the book and could not bring myself to seal it. I opened it on the bench and set the candle beside it. I left the room slowly, the key on my cord cold against my ribs. Outside, Prague breathed its raw morning. Carts on cobbles, a dog barking, a bell from a distant chapel. The world above continued its arrangements. Back in the chamber, before the candle guttered, I made a decision that resolved the night's small conflict. I dipped the quill and scored one last mark on the page. A tally drawn with a deliberate, bloody arc where the ink bled into the paper. I closed the ledger and let the edge catch the smear so that it left a single, obvious blemish when the book shut. The mark would be found later if anyone bothered to pry. It would be unreadable to those who needed denial. It was both a record and a question. I left the ledger on the bench and slid the key further into my satchel. I tightened the cord around my neck with fingers that trembled from cold and from the aftershock of the sound that had broken the rules. My last concrete act in the room was to snuff the candle with the heel of my hand. The wax hissed. The light died. My steps muffled against the descent as I moved through the corridor toward the stair that led into the waking city. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused and looked back down the narrow shaft. No one called me. The morning filled the courtyard with labor, and the chamber's mouth was a dark line beneath the stone. I put the satchel around my shoulder and walked away. I had made a choice that closed the night's immediate dilemma. I had preserved the ledger and the smear. I had not explained the phenomenon. I had not told Clav that the cries began before his rod. I had not destroyed my work to protect the spectacle. The chapter ends with an action anchored to the events. I slipped the ledger under my coat and walked into the street, deciding to keep the evidence close and to test it again when men were less certain. Outside, a hawker shouted a price and a child ran past with a clatter. My footfalls matched the city's rhythm. I kept my eyes ahead and my hands near the satchel where the ledger lay like a heart. The night had given a single answer. The sound did not belong to the instrument. I would return to the chamber to check, to count, and to see if the tally repeated. For now, the ledger stayed shut and the smear remained where my thumb had pressed it, a small, concrete witness to what happened under the candle. The decision resolved the chapter's immediate conflict. I had chosen containment over confession. I had not yet revealed the ledger's full pattern to anyone who could change the chamber's methods. The Nameless would likely survive this session. Clav would continue his displays. My obsession would continue, driven now by a careful fear and a stubborn curiosity. I walked on into the morning with the weight of ink and the pulse of a secret, and I kept counting aloud under my breath so the numbers would not forget who had written them. They yanked me from sweat and fever. A guard shoved a trembling man past my knees and Master Clav barked, "Jakub, count." Suspicion tightened my palms around the ledger before I could stand. My breath hit the stone and the Nameless screamed, not the measured sound I knew from the slab, but a raw, rising voice from the corridor that began before any instrument moved. I said the number aloud because that is what I do, but the sound had already happened and my voice filled the chamber around it. I had kept that ledger since the first night I sat at the bench. The quill had scratched a number while a man convulsed on the slab in an entry I still smelled on my fingers. The memory of that entry, ink dark against damp paper, the trimmer in my thumb while I said 1, sat behind my eyes and shaped everything I did. Suspicion guided me now. The ledger had been a means to control noise, to map pain on a page. If a scream could begin before tools were shown, then the ledger no longer measured instruments. It measured something else. I stepped forward, the bench creaking under a weight of habit, and set the ledger flat. Guards scattered pigment on the floor with their boots. "Jakub," Master Clav said, his voice low and sharp, "do not dawdle." He stepped to the bench in his boots, left damp circles in the sawdust. I dipped the quill and the ink pulled thin lines across the page in the warm candlelight one, I said, and my voice was practical, methodical, the sound that had calmed me through long nights. The Nameless's throat worked. I watched his mouth and my hand wrote the mark. Then another shriek, too close, from down the corridor, and I froze. I lifted my head and saw nothing but the corridor's shuttered windows and the silhouette of a guard. The sound did not match the timing of the instruments. My pulse tightened. Doubt moved through me like a cold draft. Master Vclav's jaw tightened. He spat. Noise to unsettle. Stage it if necessary. Noise, I asked. My voice left the ledger and sought his face. It started before, silence your hesitance, Jacob. Vclav clipped my name and the command. He reached for the interrogation rod leaning against the bench and let his gloved fingers drag along the brass handle. Do what you always do. Measure. He did not look at the ledger. He wanted spectacle, not numbers. I felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion slid into doubt and then into a cold, practical fear. I had to know whether the scream was a function of method or something else that had learned to imitate method. That need made choices for me. I glanced at the ledger, then to the door, then back at Vclav. My fingers traced the edge of the page and found the indented tally from earlier that night. The ink there had dried into a shadow of a number I had made before. I remembered the earlier entry precisely, the scratch, the press of the quill, the way the page had sucked at the ink. And now I saw it beneath my palm as proof that my counting had been working, proof until it was not. A guard, Petra, who had worked the corridor for years, pulled me aside while Vclav barked orders. Jacob, some men cry in their cells before anyone comes, she said without looking me in the eye. Her voice was low and steady, the kind that reported facts rather than begged belief. I checked 2 cells 10 minutes ago. They were quiet. Then they started humming, then short cries. No one touched them. Petra, I said, and the name opened room. Which cells? She pushed a thumb toward the western row, cells 5 and 7. Same patterns, like repeated spits of sound. That was the second shift. Doubt moved toward fear. The ledger was no longer a ledger alone. It was a map showing a spread. If the cries happened inside closed doors, whatever caused them was not limited to the bench. My throat tightened, and I felt the ledger's leather strap under my fingers like a pulse point. Vclav swore and ordered a change of procedure. He wanted demonstration. Bring the man from cell 7, he said. Faster than the sentence needed. Stage a harsher display. If they wail from fright, we will have a spectacle for testimony. They must break, I objected. Master Vclav, the sound tailed the corridor earlier. If it starts before, no speculation. He cut me with one glance. Do as I say, Jacob. Count when they scream. We will see what fear is worth. His impatience became a contest. I knew which side of that contest I would stand on. I had always stood with numbers. My compulsion to make pain legible pushed me to obey and to observe. I nodded and followed the guards while the Nameless was dragged along the stone with rough hands. The man huddled, legs threaded and shaking. He murmured nothing coherent, but his mouth formed a word, and then the corridor swallowed it. We reached cell 7, and a guard shoved the door open. The man inside sat back against the wall and stared. He made no conscious sound until a guard prodded his knee with a boot and shouted. Then the prisoner screamed long and raw. I wrote the tally without thinking, the quill moving like muscle memory. I marked the line, said the number aloud, let the ledger hold it. Later, when the corridor fell to a silence that tasted like spilled candle grease, one guard pulled me into the narrow passage between cells and said, I heard a scream in 5 again an hour ago. No one was near. I watched the spy hole. No one moved. Did it sound the same? I asked. I could not help myself. Numbers were not enough. I wanted patterns that matched sound to cause. Yes, he said. Same cadence. You know the one, short, then long. The Nameless crouched on the slab when Vclav dragged him in for the scheduled demonstration. I set the ledger on the bench and felt the quill's weight. The guard who had pushed him earlier kept his hands on the man's shoulders. Vclav circled like a butcher inspecting his knives. He tapped the brass rod on his palm and said, again, show me the fear. I counted. I moved. The second shift occurred within my hands. Methodical counting turned to nausea that made my fingers shake. The ledger demanded numbers. My body wanted to look for the origin of sound. My throat dried and my voice clipped as I read the page. I said 1, and the sound rose. I said 2, and the sound shuddered. Each tally pressed the moment into paper and made it a thing I could inspect. Midnight stretched toward dawn and the pattern tightened like a net. Guards began to fidget at posted doors. My ears tuned to the corridor in a way I had not had to allow before. I listened for the short, then long cadence, for a tremor in the stone underfoot. The third shift came. Fear bloomed into a single, brutal compulsion. I needed to know whether the tali followed instruments, or whether the tali simply answered some other current running beneath the prison. Jakub. Vaclav said softly at one moment, lowering his voice so only I could hear, "If you fail to keep order, we will replace your hand with someone else's." I said, "Master Vaclav, if the cries begin alone, the records will show it. Let me compare cell reports before spectacle." He laughed, a small dry sound that carried no humor. "Compare then. But when the show begins, you will count." I checked cells again. In 5 I watched a man sit on a pallet and hum under his breath. He did not hum a tune. He made a simple inhalation and then a cut of noise that rose without being prompted. I recorded it on a scrap of paper and then cross-checked it against my ledger. The tally for that hour had been made earlier. The mark on my page existed before the event I had just watched. Jakub. Petra later. "Are you sure you are not writing the numbers before they come?" Her question hit like a stone. I withdrew my hand from the ledger and inspected my ink-stained thumb. I had always timed my marks with the sound. Now the marks sometimes sat like ghosts on the page when nothing had yet happened at the slab. The thought that my own ritual might be anticipating events made my mouth go dry. I tried to measure the thought, to test it with another action. At dawn, several cells cried out at once. The sound arrived in an ordered chaos. Short bursts from 3 cells, a long howl from 2 others, then a staccato chorus from the holding corridor. No guard touched any door in that span. The entire complex filled with noise, and I could not reconcile the ledger with the moment. I set the quill down because my hand refused. The ledger had tally marks that I had not written. The ink on their edges was still tacky where my quill had not even touched. Vaclav stared at the bench and then at the vaulted ceiling. For the first time I watched his face lose the composure he wore, like armor. He barked orders and then, in a shorter breath, said nothing more. His command dissolved into the scramble of men trying to calm the prisoners. "Jakub," he finally said, louder than a command and softer than a threat. "Are you counting?" I could not speak. The ledger filled like an animal taking shelter. Marks that looked like my own handwriting appeared along the margin where I had left the page blank. I ran my fingers along the ink and felt a wetness that was not there before I touched it. The guards crowded the bench and fevered hands tried to smooth pages that no longer waited for a quill. The chorus stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Men leaned on knees and coughed. The nameless stared with eyes that seemed to have swallowed light. Vaclav stepped to the bench, put both palms flat on the ledger, and made a single mark in his own small book at his side. I saw the motion because I could not turn away. I asked, "What did you do?" He nothing. His jaw worked and he moved away to bark at a guard who was trying to lift the nameless. Petra looked at me as if to say we both saw it. She mouthed my name and then said, "He marked his book." The private mark was a twist I had not expected. Vaclav had always kept his own records. Names, payments, punishments. That single furtive tally suggested a ledger within a ledger, a secrecy that kept accounts hidden from ordinary sight. The revelation shifted the field. The problem was not only unpredictable screams, it was men with books who reacted to them differently. I could have protested. I could have demanded to see Vaclav's pages. Instead, I opened my ledger and checked the line where my quill had left the mark earlier that night. The ink matched in darkness and pressure to my hand, but I could not explain why some marks appeared before any sound and why the marks in my hand sometimes echoed marks made secretly by another. Vaclav asked the guards to clear the chamber while he spoke low with the jailer. The men obeyed, then left the bench with a weighty, businesslike silence. The chamber shrank to the bench, the ledger, and me. I touched the quill and felt the fatigue in the muscles of my wrist. Obsession called me back. The ledger remained the place where I fought confusion. I moved to cell 5 alone, clutching the scrap of paper that recorded the hum. The man inside watched me with a film over his eyes. He did not speak when I stepped to the bars. I said, "Who are you?" He answered with a name, thin, hoarse. I repeated the name aloud and wrote it down. I checked my ledger and found the name had already been written that night with the same hand I had used. That observation planted a deeper twist. Entries in the ledger matched real prisoners, and yet sometimes anticipated the sounds they were supposed to record. It suggested coordination between the record and the recorded, not merely coincidence. I walked back to the bench and found Vaclav watching me. "You went to 5, he said. He did not ask permission. He stated it. "Yes," I said. "I did." He tapped his ring with a fingernail and said, "Do not go alone again." His warning had the weight of a promise. I felt the first concrete decision of the chapter forming. I would test the ledger against an uncontrolled event, a moment where no man could stage a sound. I told no one. I left an empty page and set the quill aside. At prayer dawn, when the last guttering candle threw thin light across the bench, a single cry issued from a cell not on my list. It was the clear, unpracticed sound of someone surprised by pain or memory. I did not move at first. Then I took the ledger and walked toward that cell with hands that did not trust steadiness. The man inside pressed his palms to the bars and stared at me. He did not look like the nameless I had counted before. His hair was cropped, his face raw with new bruises. He looked at me and asked, "Why count it?" I said, "Because I must know what the sound is." He laughed once, a dry rasp. "You think your numbers can make it stop." I opened the ledger. The page opposite the empty line already bore a mark. The ink had dried into the parchment before I set it there. My hand hovered over the quill and my mouth tasted of copper. Then, against every command I had obeyed since I learned to write, I wrote twice in a row. One mark to match the sound and another mark to question the page itself. My hand shook and the quill dragged. The second mark looked like my own handwriting but was slanted wrong, hurried. When I looked up, Vaclav stood in the doorway. "You test the ledger for yourself. I needed to know," I began, "if your numbers measure the world or if the world measures you." Yes, he closed the cell door with the butt of his hand and walked to the bench. He put his palm over my ledger and did not look at me, only at the page. Then he slid his own notebook from his coat and set it on top, facing down. He tapped the corner with the tip of his glove, a motion that meant he had made the same mark earlier and kept it secret. The twist was no longer small. It was a deliberate action by a man who governed sound with his eyes and kept a private tally. Vaclav said, "Keep counting tonight, Jakub. Do not let the method collapse." I understood then that the ledger was becoming a battleground between men who measured and men who controlled measurements. The final clash, that night's chorus where cells erupted without provocation, had not answered the question. It had widened it. My compulsion to render suffering legible remained intact, but now my work forced choices I did not want. Obey Vaclav's command and remain complicit, or refuse and risk being replaced by a hand that would write those numbers without looking at the face of the man whose voice made them. I returned to the bench and set the ledger down. The candle guttered. My thumb left a smear of ink where I had pressed too hard. Petra shifted behind me and said, "We all heard it. We all saw him mark. What will you do?" she asked. I closed the ledger and slid it into the satchel at my side. "I will count," I said. "I will also watch the margins." She nodded, and her face showed the clear exhaustion of a guard who had learned to live with orders and secrets. We both understood the shape of the night. A chorus that could arrive before instruments, a man with a private book, and a clerk whose compulsion had turned into surveillance. The ledger had begun to dictate more than noise. It demanded choices from everyone who touched it. At dawn, when the courtyard light eased through barred windows, Vaclav left the bench and did not look back. He made no proclamation about failure. He walked with a man who kept his own tallies. I stayed and opened the ledger. A new tally bled into the corner of the page, as if ink had slipped from an unseen hand. I set my finger over it and felt the cold wetness under the ink. I reached for the quill, and the chapter closed not on answers but on a decision. I would follow the ledger's marks and learn whether they foretold events, recorded them, or commanded them into being. The final line of the night was not a promise of resolution, it was a concrete action. Vaclav's hand left a single mark in his own book. I left the ledger open where I could see both his mark and mine. That was the fact that would shape the next hour. I put the quill to paper and began to write what I heard. The scream hit me on the stone landing and I stopped mid-tally. Obsession tightened my fingers around the quill. I had counted in that corridor before, counted while a man convulsed and said the number aloud until my voice filled the chamber, but this was different. The scream came before any leather strap, before the rack groaned, and my hand had already marked a notch. I heard a guard shove wood and boots, heard Master Vclav's heavy step behind him, and I felt the ledger's weight settle against my wrist like a small accusation. I moved down the stairs because protocol demanded it. I moved down because obsession made the movement automatic. I moved because I needed the ledger to match the world. The guard pushed the Nameless forward with a rough elbow. The Nameless stumbled and struck his shoulder against cold stone. "Jubcont," Master Vclav said once. The name clipped and measured. His voice left no room for hesitation. I answered aloud, though I wanted not to. "One," I said, and my voice landed louder than the Nameless's raw cry. The ledger lay open on my knee. My thumb, stained with old ink, kept the paper flat. I had said that number before. In the first ledger I ever kept a full entry for. I had written the stroke while a man screamed, and I had spoken the digit as if it were a bell. That memory sat in my ribs like a splinter. We took the Nameless down to the chamber. The door gave a low iron groan, and the smell of damp stone and candle smoke met us. I set the ledger at my bench and laid the quill beside it. Master Vclav moved to the slab with his brass-handled rod. He inspected the rope, the buckles. He never called the prisoner by any name. He called the Nameless what he was. An instrument in his hands, Jacob, Vclav said. "Closer now," his voice a low edge. "Follow the pattern." "Your count," he tapped the ledger with a gloved finger. "We will know if you deviate. We will know." He did not need to say why. I opened the ledger and my hands trembled. The Nameless watched the page. His eyes found the paper with a sudden, fearful focus that made my breath stick. He mouthed nothing. He was tied at the wrists and ankles, a torn scrap of cloth bound at one wrist. He smelled of sweat and iron. He swallowed and made a small sound that could have been a sob. I recall the first time I had felt the compulsion become more than duty. I had sat by a wooden table and written the number while a man's throat worked on the slab. I had said the count aloud and realized my voice outran his. That realization made me build rules. The rules kept me steady. They let me think I was measuring rather than causing. That belief had lasted until this night. Master Vclav began the usual sequence. He ordered the guard to tighten the straps, and he ran his hand along a row of instruments with the careful attention of a man preparing a public sermon. He liked the theater of his tools. "Brace him," Vclav said. "Jacob, begin." He did not wait for me to draw breath. He commanded because power was his habit. I hesitated only for a fraction. Suspicion rose like a physical pressure behind my sternum. Suspicion that something in the ledger or in my counting had changed the order. I found the word in my own throat. Obsession again. The same impulse that had driven me to measure, and I listened more than usual. The Nameless's chest rose and fell. The guard, a squat man with a scar on his chin, shifted his weight. My eyes flicked to the ledger. There were fresh tallies on the next page that I had not made. They were not neat. They matched my handwriting in the slanted way might crossed and the way I dragged the quill at the end of a stroke. The tally marks came before we had begun the first instrument. My breath knocked against the stone, shallow and hot. I flipped the page and found more marks, each preceding an action by the fraction of a heartbeat. "Jacob," Vclav barked. "Why are you fumbling?" "Start." He stepped close enough that I felt the heat from his leather coat. His fingers, one with a faded burn, tightened on the handle of his rod. "Do not interrupt the order. Do your duty." The words were exact and punishing. I could not answer with more than my hands. I wanted to point to the ledger. I wanted to say, "Look at these marks. They are here already. They are written." Instead, I touched the ink with a trembling thumb and felt it tack under my nail. The Nameless's gaze tracked the page, as if the marks were something physical moving in front of him. "He watches the paper," the guard muttered. "The fool watches writing like a sermon." The guard's voice was flat. He spat on the floor to show his contempt. There was a light, a small creak as someone shifted a chest. The chamber felt compact with waiting. I tried to speak. Master Viclav, I began. Jacob. Viclav cut me off with a short glare. The Count. Now, he did not ask, he ordered. His authority folded the room into sharp angles. So I began. I said the numbers as I had always said them. Clear consonants, a steady cadence. I wrote each stroke after I spoke. The ledger took the ink. Every sound matched a mark on the page. The Nameless's scream followed my words like an echo tethered to a post. Only tonight, the tally marks already lined the paper ahead of my speech. After the fourth count I stopped and closed the ledger to hide the marks. My palms were damp. My pulse felt like a small hammered bell against my throat. Viclav, I said the name out of habit, and the syllable tasted like iron. Viclav. Someone else has been making entries. I kept my voice low but precise. The chamber did not permit hiding. His eyes hardened. Who he? The question was short. It carried the implication that any answer other than me would require explanation and the kind of violence he enjoyed. Who touches the ledger when you are not present? No one touches it, I said. I felt the ledger's spine press into my palm. It writes before any method. The tallies are already there. My speech was a step away from accusation. I kept it factual. He moved to the bench and flipped the page. He smoothed the paper with gloved fingers and read the notches. His mouth tightened. This is nonsense, he said. You try to create disorder to avoid blame. He shoved the rod into a rack and turned to the guard. Search him. The ledger is yours, Jacob. You answer for it. The guard came with accusation in his step and fingers that found the ledger and flicked pages, like a man checking accounts. The Nameless lay strapped, eyes fixed on us. I watched the guard's thumb brush a tally mark and lift a thin smear of ink to his nail. He cursed at the stain and wiped it on his sleeve. The guard's hands smelled of sweat and old ale. At that moment the Nameless made a sound that was not the measured cry we expected. A single word, hoarse and clear. Stop. The syllable had a brittle, urgent edge. He had not said the word when we planned the sequence. He had not had the chance. His voice pulled at my chest, and I looked up at Viclav in the guard. Viclav's face tightened into a line. He barked at the guard, tie his jaw if he speaks. He will not break the order with speech. He leaned over the Nameless and pressed his hand to the man's temple with a practiced, almost gentle motion. The effort was a claim of control, a way to remold what the Nameless still tried to be. I felt suspicion shift into fear then. My hands, which had always been my instruments, slid. The ledger was a tool. But what if the ledger had become a trigger? I had built a ritual, and rituals, once repeated enough, taught the world how to answer them. The thought moved through me not as a revelation, but as a practical, testable claim. If I were honest, the idea terrified me. I tested it in my head the only way I had always tested, by altering the motion. I mimed the tally without sound. I set my quill above the paper and did the cutting gesture with my wrist, but did not touch ink to page. The Nameless cried out anyway. The scream grew even though no instrument had touched him and no mark had appeared. Viclav's jaw worked. He misread my inaction as sloppiness. You play games, Jacob, Viclav said. You play at piety and refuse the duty. He moved faster, his patience narrowing. Count properly or I will find another clerk. His hand knocked the ledger closed, and the sound was like a final stroke. I could have spoken then. I could have said, watch the page. The tallies were already there before you pushed the rope. I could have forced him to see a pattern. Instead, I did something almost impossible. I refused to make a sound. I let the motion fall from my hand without the number leaving my throat. I lifted the quill, I mimed the sweep, and I kept my lips sealed. The Nameless screamed. His body arched in the straps, though nothing touched him. He clawed at the air with a hand that had no leverage. The sound rose in a raw animal way and filled the chamber until even the small iron key at my belt seemed to vibrate with it. Viclav lunged. He shoved aside the bench and grabbed my collar as if the act of silence were an assault on his authority. You will not, Viclav snapped. And his fist found the ledger with a gloved hand and slammed it open. You will not deny me the sequence. He pulled the quill from my hand and slammed it to the page. He spoke the numbers himself. One, he drew ink across paper, and the Nameless's cry changed when the number hit the air. Master Viclav, stop, I said, but my voice was raw. I had not expected the next move. The ledger bore tallies in my handwriting aligned to my inhalation. When he read them aloud, the Nameless staggered as if the marks were cords tightening. Viclav, I insisted, read the next page. Your voice, your count, read the page that was marked before we began. He looked down, anger like a tight seam on his face. The guard stepped forward with a hand on his belt. Jacob, the guard said, you begged trouble. You want to be blamed if he escapes. The guard spat again. Václav's voice tightened. Bring the iron bell. He signaled for a small brass bell that hung near the instruments. He rang it once, quick and thin. The sound was a command. He snapped the strap tighter around the nameless. I moved to the bench and opened the ledger with my left hand, fingers working despite the tremor. I turned to the page with the pre-existing marks. My eyes traced the notches and realized that their spacing matched the way I breathed when I prepared to speak. The tollies came at the moment my lungs drew in before I began the count. The pattern repeated across entries. A mark ahead of the sound, a mark before the instrument, a mark on the ledger at the intake of breath. I felt a new emotion press through me. Not only fear but shame folded with a sudden defiance. If my attention began the scream, then my silence might stop it. If my ritualized breath cued the cry, a refusal could break the chain. The idea was a small, bright thing that terrified and freed me in equal measure. I set the quill down and looked at Václav. Do not speak for me, I said. My voice was steady now. Do not give my job to your mouth. Let me close the ledger and we will do this differently. My hands were steady enough, surprising me. He laughed and then did not do differently. How do you mean? Václav's question carried suspicion folded into commanding interest. He was a man who enjoyed demonstrations of authority. A change in ritual interested him because it could be broken and therefore reasserted. I told him plainly, I will not speak. I will not inhale audibly before the count. Watch me move and do not let your breath answer mine. My statement was not rhetorical. It was a test. The guard scoffed. The guard said, Jacob, you re mad. You will let him go. He will tear free. And he didn't finish. The chamber already held the small static of danger. Václav moved close, the creak of his boot echoing. He placed his hand on my shoulder with a pressure that was both possessive and a warning. You will obey protocol, he said. You will not make me look weak. I nodded once because the room required gestures. Then I set my jaw and refused to speak. I mimed the first tally, the second, the third. The quill tip hovered. The nameless began to whimper and then to cry, without reason that we could see. His knuckles whitened on the slab ropes. His mouth opened in an animal shape and no instrument touched him. Master Václav's shoulders hunched with the effort to maintain the show. The guard's fingers tightened on a strap. Václav tried to take the ledger from me. His gloved hand closed around the binding, and for a moment we both held it. He shoved. I resisted. The ledger swung between us, a small honest weight. The nameless's cry escalated into a sound I had never catalogued. Not the measured pitches I had learned to place in my ledger, but a noise that came from the throat like a person being torn and stitched at once. I felt my body react with nausea. He yelled, Count! The demand burst into the chamber like a whip. Count, Jacob, or I will. His threat stopped in his throat because the nameless convulsed violently and then went quiet with the suddenness of a struck animal. There was a twitch. The guards moved as if to seize the body. Václav's hand fell away from the ledger. The nameless lay still. He had not been touched. No visible blow had fallen. He shivered and then did not. His chest rose and fell once and then stilled. The chamber held the shape of surprise. Václav cursed and bent close to the man. He felt for a pulse and then grunted. The guard pulled at the straps, loosened them only enough to check. He's breathing, the guard said, but he went limp. The voice lacked warmth. It carried only the practical assessment. I opened the ledger again. There on the page that had been cleaned before we entered, a single new tally had bled through the paper to the stone beneath. The ink sat like a dark seed. I looked at my hands at the drop of ink that had fallen from the quill earlier and landed by my thumb. The droplet shimmered like cold iron. Václav stared at the mark and then at me. Jacob, he said, and the name held a question that had sharpened into accusation. Did you do this? Did you call him to die? He stepped closer until I felt his breath against my cheek. No, I said. I spoke with the small, exact voice I had used often to keep myself blameless. I did not make that mark. I felt my throat constrict. The ledger sat open and the tally stared back like a wound. He did not accept it. He gripped the ledger, flipped pages, and then slammed it closed. He seized the quill and nicked his finger with it on purpose or by accident. He showed a tiny bead of blood on his glove and then wiped it on the sleeve of his coat. "You will learn to keep your tools in order," he muttered. "If you cannot, I will find a clerk who can." He turned and left the chamber with the guard, his boots echoing up the stair. After they were gone, the room contracted. The Nameless lay on the slab and breathed in shallow, uncertain gasps. His eyes were open and wet. He watched the ledger on my bench with the same dead focus as before. I took my quill and drew the smallest notch onto the blank margin near the single new tally. My hand trembled as I placed the ink. I did not say a number. I did not speak. I thought about the pattern and what it meant. That my attention, my inhalation, my ritualized movement might cause the scream. That thought moved into another. If a silence could be tested, could a silence be weaponized? My mind, always trained to measure and then to infer, began to make calculations. This was my work. My obsession always pushed me to reduce pain to a readable thing. Now the ledger showed me that the act of reading might remake what it read. I tied the ledger shut with twine and walked to the slab. The Nameless turned his head to meet me. I knelt and set my palm against the damp of his forehead. He flinched, but he did not scream. His eyes searched mine as if for a name. "Who are you?" I asked softly, though I knew his name would be a lie if I offered one. He tried to answer and breathed. "Jacob." The name came out as a rasp. He had no certainty. He grabbed at my wrist with a strength that startled me. "Jacob, do not." And his mouth closed on the plea. His hand loosened. I left the chamber then, and went outside into the stair landing where the night air pooled. I sat on a worn step and untied the small iron key from my cord. I rolled it between my fingers until the metal felt like a separate measure of weight. I remembered the first ledger entry again, the scrape of quill and my voice louder than a man's cry. The memory was a stubborn fact. I had shaped myself around that fact. Now the ledger altered the fact back at me. I felt a new movement in me. Not merely obsession now, but a thin defiance that wanted to break the ritual by refusing the act that fed the sound. I would not be a simple recorder any longer if my recording made the event it recorded inevitable. I could not accept the ledger's power without testing the limits. Hours passed in small gestures. I reordered the instruments into a different pattern under the bench. I catalogued the marks with a fine pencil on a spare sheet and compared spacing, breadth, and sequence. I called the guard's name to ask a practical question about a strap and watched how his hand tightened on the ring where the keys hung. I forced the world into measurable moves so that my mind could find purchase. When dawn began to thin the grime at the edges of the stair light, Master Vclav returned alone. He walked with his usual authority, but with a shadow at his mouth I had not seen before. He stood over the ledger on my bench and touched the single new tally as if it were not to be opened. "This will not stand," he said. He did not say it to me in a pleading way, but as a fact he needed confirmed. I answered, "I will close the ledger and keep watch." Tonight we changed the pattern. My voice was small. I did not promise anything grand. I promised practical measures. He looked at me appraisingly. "If you are right, Jacob," he said, "and your counting becomes something else, then we must learn how to use it. If you are wrong, you will be blamed for errors you did not intend." He tapped the ledger and then nodded toward the Nameless on the slab. "Decide." I decided by action. I stepped to the slab and loosened the ropes carefully. The guard protested from the doorway when he saw the slackened straps. "Don't," he said. "He'll leap and ruin everything." I met his eyes and stayed even. "Let him catch his breath," I said. "Let him speak without a number on his throat." My words were not a plea. They were an experiment. The Nameless breathed, his chest moving with effort. He looked at me and then at Vclav. "Jacob, why did you stop?" His voice had a thin thread of accusation. "You had always counted." He searched my face as if proving that the man who measured was still the man who measured. "I learned things tonight," I said. "I learned there are tallies before actions. I learned the ledger may answer me as much as I answer it." I left the words short. He watched my hands where the ink stain shone like a promise. Vclav's reaction was quick. "Then we must control it," he said. "If your breath makes a cry, we will use your breath to make confessions where before there were none. We will bind those who resist with your numbers." He smiled in the way of a man who sees profit. The smile chilled me because it meant he understood the ledger as a lever for power. I understood then the final shift of feeling, from suspicion to fear to defiant curiosity, and finally to a hard, wary shame that settled in my limbs. The ledger would not be merely scientific. It would be a weapon if I allowed it. Václav's greed for results would bend my measures into orders to be enforced. I made a choice that was small and concrete. I took the ledger to the windowed stair and tied it into a leather satchel I had received as part of my clerk's kit. I placed the small iron key inside the satchel and set the strap over my shoulder. I told Václav I will keep the ledger locked. I will not let it be read for ritual when I am not present. If you seek confessions bought with my breath, you will have to ask me first. My voice did not plead, it set terms. He laughed a rough sound. You think you can bargain, Jacob? He said, you hold a quill. You think that will save you? He paused and then said plainly, very well. Keep your ledger. Prove it is yours. Prove it can be controlled. Tonight we will test it together. We tested nothing in the end. The night brought a small chaos. The Nameless escaped in a way that could have been a seizure or a cunning upheaval of brute will. He pulled at a strap with a force that surprised us all and slipped free. He ran and then collided with the guard at the stair. The noise woke adjacent rooms. In the scramble, someone knocked a candle from its holder. The flame leapt and then guttered out as cold air crossed the stair. I stood at the bench, the satchel heavy and warm against my chest, the ledger inside like a quiet animal. Someone shoved the guard aside, and the Nameless vanished into a labyrinth of stone and night. Václav swore and banged his fist against the wall. He left the chamber in a fury that would be answered with orders. After the rush, I returned to the bench. The ledger felt different in my satchel. I opened it with hands that did not show relief. The page we had studied before held a single new tally, and that mark had blood through to the stone beneath, dark and wet. I set the quill on the bench and watched a drop of ink fall and spread. The drop made a tiny dark ring on the wood. The sound of it landing was a small, precise punctuation. I placed the ledger on the bench and, with one slow motion, made one final mark in the margin. I did not speak a number. I let the quill draw the line, and then I folded the page down. I tied the ledger shut and I dropped the quill across the table. The candle in the holder guttered and then went out. The room went dark except for the thin blue coming from the stair where dawn had not yet found. I sat for a long time in that dark with the ledger at my knee and felt how my choices had remade the world. I had been the clerk who counted screams. I had been the man who believed measurement separated him from cruelty. Now I saw that measurement and cruelty could be braided together. I felt hollowed, like the shape of a tool with the hand removed. The ledger lay closed, and when I turned it in my hands, a single tally bled faintly through the leather. A noise from the stair announced someone returning. It was not Master Václav. It was the guard, breathless and muddy, and he held a torn scrap of cloth in his fist. He ran into the alley by the blacksmith's. The guard said, panting, Václav wants him found, but he also said not to ruin the ledger. The ledger counts more than we do. I looked at the guard. He met my eyes and then looked down at his hands. He was no philosopher. He only carried orders. He simply, Jacob, what will you do with it? The question landed with the practicalness of a man asking whether to lock a door. I had no grand answer. I had a ledger and a habit, a satchel and a quill, and knowledge that my breath could call a cry. I thought of the Nameless running through cold alleys and of Václav's smile at the thought of weaponized confessions. I imagined what would happen if I left the ledger to the court and they used it to twist men into admissions and tore families apart with numbers. I stood and walked to the bench. I took the ledger and opened to the page with the bleeding tally. I ran my thumb along the wet line until ink stained my skin. Then I took the satchel outside into the stair and down through the corridor toward the sewer mouth that led under the city. The steps were narrow and slick. I tied the ledger in the satchel twice and then once more. I set my jaw and slid the strap under the iron grate near the channel where waste and runoff gathered. I paused with my hand on the grate. The smell rose up sharp and honest. Rotten metal and the city's refuse. The ledger in its satchel weighed like a held secret. I pushed the iron up with a practiced shove and then let the satchel slip through the gap into the dark water below. The leather closed around the ledger and the strap strained for a second before it gave, and the satchel slid away into the current. A small splash sounded. The ledger disappeared into a line of black water that swallowed it. I stood and listened to the slow plop and the faint dragging sound as it moved away. My fingers were ink-stained and my palms smelled of oil and damp. I felt something like a decision settle into me, not triumph, not absolution, only the concrete consequence of action. When I returned to the chamber, it was quiet except for the echo of a distant cart. The bench had a dark ring where the drop of ink had fallen. I set the quill back in its place. I had taken one tali from the world and placed it in the current. I had not destroyed the knowledge. I had removed the ledger as an instrument of deliberate ritual. If power sought the method again, they would have to find me first. I sat down alone and touched the thin scar along my left eyebrow where a long ago slip of a knife had left a mark. I thought of the nameless and of Viclav and of the guard. I thought of the ledger's final wet tali that had blood into wood and stone, a mark tied to breath. My mouth was dry. Outside, day broke a little more. Someone knocked on the heavy door. It was a small, precise sound like a metrical count. I rose and opened it. The guard stood there with his head lowered. "Master Viclav commands your presence," he said. "He wants the ledger returned." His voice was even. He looked older. I did not argue. I stepped aside and let him through. I tugged my satchel empty and felt only the memory of weight. The stair smelled of damp and iron. The chamber waited with instruments aligned and the slab cold beneath a rag. I told the guard, "Search where you will. You will find no ledger." I did not add the truth that I had sunk it into the city's dark. He looked at me and then away. When Viclav arrived, he did not shout. He ran his palm along the bench and sat with the quiet of a man who knows a tool is missing and fears the imagination of what that absence might mean. He nothing for a long time and then asked, "Jacob, what have you done?" I met his gaze. I thought of every notch I had made, of how my voice once outrun a man's cry, of how the ledger had begun to mark moments before I acted. I did not offer a defense or a sermon. I answered with the single concrete act I had made. I sank it. I said, "I will not let our numbers be used to make people answer for what they did not do. I will not give our work to a court that calls it confession." My voice was not loud, but it was steady. He rose then, slow and deliberate. He looked at the nameless who had not escaped far enough for safety, and then at me. "You have made an enemy of me, Jacob," he said. "You have taken away a way to shape the truth." I did not flinch. "Perhaps," I said. "Or perhaps I have taken away a way for you to make men cry without being touched." The two of us stood in the small silence that followed, and then Viclav laughed once, a low sound that said he would not forget. He stepped to the door and called for the guard. He left the chamber with a slow stride. The guard followed. The click of the heavy door echoed after them. I sat alone. I touched the ink-stained thumb and felt the smear like a small, stubborn proof. I had kept the ledger from becoming a lever. I had not stopped the world from wanting it. I had only put it beyond easy reach. Outside, the city stirred. I kept my hands busy, reordering instruments and wiping down the bench. The ledger's absence moved through the day like a weather change. Men noticed in practical ways and then returned to their routines. News would travel. Men would look for a place to replicate the ritual. Viclav would find a way to bend a new method into the same shape. At dusk I lit a single candle and sat at my bench with an empty satchel beside me. I set the quill on the table and let the nib point toward the wick. My thumb left a smear on the wood where the ink had dried. I thought of the nameless and of the way his eyes had tracked the page as if marks could shape a person. I thought of the small moral math that had guided me. Measure, observe, control. I had once believed those acts could be separated from cruelty. The candle guttered. A draft passed through the corridor and the flame dipped. I held my breath, not to summon a cry, but to prove to myself that silence still belonged to me. The wick burned steady, and then a faint wind slipped through and the candle went out. In the dark I could still see the smear on the wood when I raised my palm. I closed my fingers around the small iron key and felt its cold. A single tali had bled into the margin of the ledger, and then into the stone, and then into the water. The mark remained in the world in traces. A wet ring on the bench, a memory in a guard's eyes, a weak man who called my name in the night. I had sought to make pain legible, to control it with numbers. In trying to do so, I learned that some instruments answer back. I washed my hands and left the bench clean. I tied the quill to the cord at my belt. I walked to the stair and pushed the heavy door open. The city air hit my face. I stepped out, the weight of a choice on my shoulders that had the texture of both loss and something like a small, stubborn mercy. The ledger was gone. The tally would remain a trace in the wood, a stain on my thumb, a story the city might one day tell in other words. I walked away with my hands inked and my list of measurements unfulfilled, and I felt the ledger's absence as a thing I had done, not as a thing done to me. When the guard called after me, I did not turn. Jacob, I kept walking. The name sounded the way a bell does when someone counts it and then lets it fall.